Thank you, Andre. Welcome, everyone, to our Latin American seminar. This is the last seminar of this term, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Latin American History Seminar at Oxford. It gives me a particular pleasure to introduce our session today. And for those of you who have not been here with us, I just want to say a couple of very brief words. So we launched this seminar in October 2013, and we've been meeting since then every Thursday of the term. Throughout the academic year. And in fact, we're very proud of the achievement, and I think we will be celebrating our 10th anniversary next year. So welcome to all. And this is, the seminar today will be in sort of different formats. It won't be the tertulia we've been having in the previous weeks. I will appreciate if everyone turn off their micros so we don't have any disturbances with the noises. I was just going to say, I want to thank Malcolm to suggest the organization of this seminar with Christopher. Obviously, I would like to thank Christopher, Neal, and we're going to discuss his book today. And I also want to thank Alan Knight for agreeing to be a discussant and a commentator. And as I was saying, this is going to follow a different format. After I will be stopping in 30 seconds, Malcolm will have a brief introduction, 3 minutes, of the speaker and the subject. And then the author of the book, Christopher Neal, will speak for about 30 minutes about the book and Carlton Beals, followed by some comments by Alan Knight, 15 minutes, and then Malcolm will close with some comments for another 10 minutes. Malcolm tells me that everyone should be kept to their time, so therefore, without further ado, Malcolm, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. As you said, I'm slightly responsible for Chris's book because he sent me word that he was writing it, and he asked me my help in looking for a publisher because I reviewed a previous book on Beals, to which he makes due an acknowledgement by a chap called John Britton, published in 1957, which is 35 years ago. So there's plenty of room for another work on Carlton Beals. My feelings about Carlton Beals date back to the early 1960s, when there was not very much to read. So I don't know, those of us who were starting in England in Latin American studies and study of Latin America, we read quite a lot of Carlton Beals. And Carlton Beals, of course, provided us with plenty to read. He was the author of 40 books, an indefatigable journalist, and he was usually a pretty lively read. So Beals Beals was a journalist. He was a freelance journalist all his life. He was never held an academic post, as far as I can remember, or as far as I can see, and he had no pension, and he died pretty penniless or pretty poor. The book has on the front a picture of him, by a photograph of him, there he is, by none other than Tina Mondotti. Beals, Tina Mondotti, as you know, was part of the sort of magic group of bohemians in Mexico at the same time, you know. So those of you who are fans of Frida Kahlo, Rivera, and Leon Trotsky can get another dose of that sort of stuff by reading this excellent book by Christopher, which is very, very well documented, and as I've said before, very readable, an excellent book. So I was also endeared by Beals when I was reading the first book, with a certain amount of, resistance on my part, because Beals was, after all, a sort of lifelong lefty, which I've never been. By his self-description as a horse's ass. This is, I think, is refreshing and not very common in academia for people to have such modest frankness. So anyway, Christopher has been a journalist. He has also had a foot in academia. He has a foot in journalism, a foot in academia, and a foot also in international bureaucracy, which gives him 3 feet, which may not be the right way of describing him, but that's what he is. And he's also not only an extremely readable writer, but he's also a heroic reader. He's read he must have read all of Beals, which I must say, given that Beals also wrote at least 4 completely unreadable novels, is a heroic achievement in itself. But anyway, now he's going to give you 35 minutes on Carlton Beals. Chris.
Well, thank you very much, Malcolm, for that kind introduction, and for reading my work. And I'd just like to, I'm very pleased. Thanks also to Eduardo Posada Carbo for organizing this event, and to both Malcolm and Alan and Eduardo for reading my book. I'd also like to just mention the presence of many of my friends and former colleagues who are watching here now and have tuned in, and whom you at Oxford may not recognize, but I do, and I'm pleased to see you all. I'm honored by it, and I'm honored by the distinguished company generally here. So as you've heard from Malcolm, I started my career as a journalist and later moved into communications management in Canada's federal government, and then later at the World Bank, where I spent 30 years, 5 of which were in the Latin America department. So, and when I was a journalist, I worked for several years as in Central America and South America as a freelancer for about 3 years. So for me, history is more of an avocation, but it's a passionate one. And in that regard, as Malcolm, as you've said, I have something in common with my subject, Carlton Beals, a journalist first and a historian second. I have something else in common with my subject. As I mentioned, I worked as a journalist in Central America, but 60 years after he did, in the 1980s. So I covered the Sandinista revolution. I covered civil wars in El Salvador and in Guatemala that were going on at the same time for Canadian media. And in doing that, or particularly in Nicaragua, in reading up on the origins of the Sandinista movement, I learned of Beals for the first time, and I read his stories about his interview with Sandino in 1928 with Augusto Sandino, who was then leading a liberal rebellion, or actually a nationalist liberal war against the 3,000 US Marines who were occupying the country at that time. And his sympathetic portrait of Sandino really challenged the Coolidge administration's depiction of Sandino as a bandit or a Bolshevik, undermining the case for intervention. I will return to that later, but I just mentioned that because that's what brought me to the Beals story. The more I read of Beals, the more I found it both entertaining and illuminating. Carlton Beals' work was, as you mentioned, focused on Latin America, particularly on Mexico, Central America, and Cuba, between the wars, through the Second World War, and then it wound down. But he had a kind of brief second act covering the Cuban Revolution in 1959. He achieved considerable renown in his time, covering the 1920s classic phase of the Mexican Revolution, and in liberal magazines like The Nation and New Republic, and in many books, 40 books altogether, that combined reportage and political analysis with colorful descriptions of people and places, all laced with his unabashed, often declamatory opinions. Beals was born in rural Kansas in 1893. I'm sorry, I should have shared my screen here I have a few slides, but let me just do that. So that's the cover of my book. I'll leave that up long enough so that you can see that. So Beals's father was editor of a local newspaper that supported the farmers' populist movement. The family moved to California when Beals was 3, where his mother, Elvina, became involved with the Socialist Party of America. And I'm just, okay. And she ran as a socialist for the US Senate in 1920. This is his mother. I mention it because she was one of the first women ever to run for the US Senate. And so Beals grew up in a socialist household where the family hero was American Socialist Party leader Eugene Debs. So that's how he came to his leftism. And in 1917, when the US entered the First World War, Beals had just graduated with a teaching certificate from Columbia University. He opposed the war on political and ideological grounds, as most socialists did at that time, but this did not get him the conscientious objector status that he sought, so he was jailed. He was finally released after about 6 months and declared totally unfit for military service. And at that time, he left for Mexico, which was then a refuge for US draft resistors. He began to write poetry at first, and then quickly turned to journalism, I guess because it made him more money. He would publish 40 books, as been mentioned, almost one a year, most of them nonfiction, and also hundreds of feature stories. Mexico was the country he knew best and about which he published 6 books, including 2 novels. He did significant work on Central America too, especially Nicaragua, as well as Cuba and Peru. He also published books that were overviews of Latin America as a whole, as well as a book on Mussolini's rise, on Huey Long, and on several topics of US history. He was sympathetic to revolutions, from Mexican to Cuban, and to reform-minded populists such as Aya de la Torre and Juan Perón, and also the Guatemalan Juan José Arevalo, and the Marxist theorist José Carlos Mariátegui. But he denounced military dictatorship and US policies that enabled it, in his view. Beals developed a distinctive critical voice, along with a progressive left stance that challenged America's foreign policy establishment and economic elite, which in the 1920s and 30s often pressed for military intervention to defend US investor and banking interests in Latin America. Many US introductory anthologies on Latin American history include an excerpt from Beals's work. These, it seems to me, are chosen as an example of a radical critique, or for their vivid descriptions and loose opinionated style, which might stir a younger student's interest. This is fair, but my research prompts me to plead for a more serious reading of Beals. I argue that Beals's critique anticipated later foreign policy critics, including journalists, historians, and political scientists. It was also prescient, precursor to schools of thought that, such as dependency theory, and his interpretation of US foreign policy as neo-imperialism reappears in the Wisconsin School of the 1950s of William Appleman Williams, and in the work of contemporary historians such as Greg Grandin and Andrew Basevich, among others. Now, Beals covered a lot of ground with deep dives into diverse subjects and countries. I will focus on 3 for the purpose of this presentation: Mexico, Nicaragua, and Cuba. First, Mexico. Beals arrived penniless in Mexico City in 1918. Early on, he taught English to survive. One day, an aide to President Carranza offered him a job teaching English to military officers. This gave him a front row seat to the collapse of the Carranza government not long thereafter in 1920. He was also hired as a teacher at the American School, where he was soon promoted to principal. Almost as quickly, he was fired for publicly criticizing the US government's refusal to recognize Mexico's claim for subsoil mineral rights. At that time, Mexico was the primary foreign source of oil for the United States, so it was an extremely important issue. While teaching, Beals worked on his first book, Mexico: An Interpretation. He had not found a publisher for it, though, and upon his dismissal in 1921 from the American School, he and his wife Lillian left for Italy. There, he sent dispatches to the nation on Mussolini's rising fascist movement, And he produced another book, Rome or Death, which showed a clear-eyed appreciation of the menace in Mussolini's dismantling of democracy. This would help Beals later understand Latin American caudillos, many of whom were influenced by fascism. That same year, 1923, Beals returned to Mexico and found a publisher for Mexico and Interpretation. It was a spirited but also persuasive analytical critique of the Mexican Revolution's growing pains that was met with a friendly reception from the Mexican government. It was also popular among American liberals who were opposed to the Harding administration's hostile policy towards Mexico's Obregón administration, especially with respect to oil wells in Mexico owned by the California tycoon Edward Doheny. It is a lively apologia for the revolutionary cause, with attacks on both oilmen and diplomats and Mexico's dethroned aristocrats. Beals denounced the US oil company's refusal to accept Mexico's insistence on mineral rights and the oil company's resistance to paying royalties for the oil they were pumping. At the same time, he slammed the hitherto dominant Mexican elite. I will quote here a little bit to give you the flavor of some of Beals's prose. The son of the Mexican aristocrat is brought up a snob and a tyrant, while the daughter is prepared for connubial and concubinal slavery of a jewel and silk order by being taught to dance, play the piano, speak French, read sensuous poetry and French pornographic novels, embroider, talk sex, flirt, and win a husband. Plutarco Elias Calles, elected Mexican president in 1924, and his entourage found Beals's work much to their taste. Just before the new president's inauguration, for example, Calles visited New York, to which Beals had briefly returned. The Nation magazine asked Beals to cover the president-elect's visit, but he wound up doing more than that. Calles's ambassador, Manuel Tellez, a friend of Beals's, asked him to help with writing Calles's speeches to both business and worker student audiences. Beals would cross this kind of line many times in his career. Shortly thereafter, Beals settled in Mexico for 7 years. He published 3 books on the country during this period and also wrote regular features for The Nation, The New Republic, The New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, Harper's, Current History, which was then a supplement to The New York Times. Early on, Calles gave Mexico and Interpretation an endorsement as, quote, the only authentic study on Mexico in English of present-day Mexico. I'll say that quote again. The only authentic study in English of present-day Mexico. But US authorities were less impressed. James Sheffield, at that time ambassador to Mexico for the United States, said of Beals, he's communistic in ideals and anti-American in practice, able to get his views published and to some extent influence public opinion. For Beals, Obregón and Calles were pragmatic leaders of a revolution that deserved support. Their demands for subsoil mineral rights claimed in Mexico's 1917 Constitution were legitimate in his view. Indeed, they approximated rules governing mineral rights in the United States. He also defended Calles in putting down the Cristero revolt and denounced the role of the Catholic Church in supporting it. But Beals was not a placard-waving apologist. He developed these opinions based on his own investigations and his travels, interviews with key players, and on documents and evidence to support the positions he took. Beals's sympathy for Calles diminished as Calles grew less democratic, more repressive, and corrupt. Still, Beals reined in his criticism, at least while he was living in Mexico, telling one editor that in painting the evils and abuses of the Calles regime against the church, for example, one's material is seized upon by the very people in the United States one does not wish to encourage. His 1931 book, Mexican Maize, my favorite, was illustrated by Diego Rivera, with whom Beals struck up a friendship. The drawing I have in the slide is from that book. In the same social circle were Bert and Ella Wolf, both communist labor union activists from New York, and Mexicologists such as Francis Tour, Howard Phillips, Frank Tannenbaum, and Ernest Greening, who became editor of The Nation and later the first governor and senator for the new state of Alaska, along with the writers Catherine Ann Porter and Anita Brenner. Other friends were the photographers Edward Weston and Tina Modotti, whom, as Malcolm said, took the picture that's on the cover of my book. Also the Cuban Marxist student leader, Julio Antonio Mella, who was Tina Modotti's lover and later murdered in Mexico. His larger circle and readers included the Mexican artistic and political elite, anthropologist Manuel Gamio, and also Josephus Daniels, who was a mentor to Franklin Roosevelt and later his ambassador to Mexico, all of whom read Beals's books and took time to send him congratulatory notes. This social circle gave his work a depth and a richness that really gives you the feel of life in Mexico City at the time. It's zeitgeist. Okay, Nicaragua. In January 1928, Beals accepted a suggestion from Oswald Garrison Villard, publisher of The Nation, that he traveled to Nicaragua to interview Augusto Cesar Sandino, who was then leading a volunteer army fighting an occupation force of nearly 3,000 US Marines. He rode horseback for 2 weeks, connecting with Sandino at his camp. His series, With Sandino in Nicaragua, was published over 2 months in The Nation. He also filed stories to wire services, which were picked up by the New York Times and the Washington Post, among many others around the world. It was a huge story, a scoop at the time, all the more so as progressives in Congress were pushing for withdrawal of US forces from Nicaragua. Beals's journalistic feat was part of a campaign undertaken by progressives in the US, including Villard at The Nation, to challenge the escalation of US intervention in Nicaragua under Coolidge. US troops had first been sent to Nicaragua by President Taft in 1909 to support a conservative party revolt against the dictator Zelaya. The US had sought to protect US-owned banana, mining, coffee, and lumber interests, along with concessions they had to use riverboats and railways. This infrastructure had been financed by US bank loans, and the US needed a pliant government to collect and remit customs duties to service those loans. The Marines' ranks had dwindled through the 19-teens to 1924. But in 1925, Conservative Party caudillo Emiliano Chamorro, who'd been defeated in a US supervised election the year before, led a coup. This toppled President Solórzano, who fled to exile. Solórzano's vice president, the liberal Juan Sacasa, launched a new civil war against conservatives led by Chamorro. US diplomats pushed Chamorro to resign in favor of the more amenable conservative, Adolfo Deas. In 1927, to shore up Deas as president, Coolidge sent 2,000 more Marines and ordered another US supervised election in 1928. Meantime, US Secretary of War Henry Stimson convinced the liberal military chief, General Jose Moncada, to lay down arms and run for president under US Marine protection. But one liberal general refused, Augusto Sandino. Sandino was a small town mechanic. He lived in Tampico, Mexico for 3 years, where he'd been impressed by labor activism among oil workers and social legislation brought in by Mexico's revolutionary government. Thus inspired, he'd returned to Nicaragua to participate in the liberal uprising against the first Chamorro and then Deas. He'd raised and armed a small band and approached General Moncada, the liberal general, to join liberal forces. Moncada did not trust Sandino, though. He thought him a communist. But others in the liberal camp prevailed upon Moncada to make Sandino a general and responsible for the liberal forces in the northern Segovia Mountains. But when Moncada agreed with Stimson to demobilize the liberal army and accept the 1928 elections supervised by US troops, Sandino saw this as treason. "I want a free country or death," he declared, and he was soon leading a volunteer army fighting a guerrilla war against the Marines that would last 7 years. The US government and media depicted Sandino as a bandit or a Bolshevik to justify their intervention. Beals, however, produced a very sympathetic portrait of the liberal general, a kind of everyman's patriot who devoted his life to the struggle against US occupation, guided by a religiously inspired idealism. That's why I call him Sandino's myth maker. Beals' nation stories left the bandit story pretty flat, his editor told him, doing much to discredit the whole US military effort. His reports were also cited on the floor of the US Congress by progressives who opposed the Nicaraguan intervention. Sandino's forces were well entrenched and popular, Beals reported. This directly contradicted the claim by Navy Secretary Curtis Wilbur that Sandino had fled to Honduras. Beals' version cast doubt on all of the US claims that Sandino was a criminal, a Bolshevik, that he had no support, that he was on the run, that the US was defending democracy, that meaningful elections could be held in a country in which several provinces were at war. I found archival records showing US diplomats and military agreed with Beals' position, although of course they did not say so at the time. In retrospect, Beals' indictment of the intervention has proven correct. It resulted in hundreds, perhaps thousands of deaths, including 135 Marines. Their occupation of Nicaragua actually sustained Sandino's rebellion rather than checking it, and their legacy was the establishment of Nicaragua's National Guard. This repressive force sustained the Somoza's control of Nicaragua's government from the 1930s to 1979, when a newly minted version of Sandinistas overthrew it. Of course, tragically, that movement has since been vitiated by the Ortega family, whose own corruption and repression is now compared to that of Somoza's. In 1932, Beals went to Cuba to investigate the regime led by Gerardo Machado, president. Machado had been elected in 1925 and again in 1928, after which he'd manipulated Cuba's Congress to extend his term for another 6 years. Unrest was mounting by the time Beals arrived. The Depression had sent Cuba's sugar economy into collapse. Unemployment and destitution were widespread. Political conflict had gone underground and become murderous. Clemente Vázquez Bello, a prominent pro-Machado senator, was murdered by a terrorist group called the ABC, for example, when Beals arrived. There followed revenge killings of 3 brothers named Freire de Andrade, all Machado critics. Beals was to interview one of them, a legislator, but was horrified to find his and his 2 brothers' bloodied corpses upon his arrival at their home. Beals spent 6 weeks in Cuba. He produced a blistering indictment of Machado's rule in a book called The Crime of Cuba. This Walker Evans photo of a Havana street was on the cover. In that book, Beals also denounced what he saw as US complicity with Machado, taking particular aim at US Ambassador Harry Guggenheim. It was not quite fair, as Guggenheim had actually been trying to ease Machado out, but Beals might have learned that had he interviewed Guggenheim, which he did not, as the ambassador was absent during Beals's visit to Cuba. In any event, when the book was published in July 1933, Cuba was on the cusp of a revolution. Sumner Welles, President Roosevelt's top foreign policy advisor, pictured here shaking hands with Batista, was sent, or rather sent himself, to negotiate with Machado for his exit. These negotiations between the regime and opposition groups were suspended when a national strike was launched. A faction of the ABC led a mob attack on the presidential palace. Police fired on the crowd, killing 20 people and wounding over 100. There followed a complex series of events which concluded with the takeover by a student army junta led by Ramon Grau San Martin, a professor of medicine, and Fulgencio Batista, a sergeant leading a barracks revolt. With Beals's book being prominently reviewed just as these events took place, he was positioned as a key commentator on Cuba. He returned to revolutionary Cuba in December of 1933, where he was welcomed as El Gran Periodista Yankee by Grau's government. It did not last. A month later, Beals witnessed the junta's collapse as Sumner Welles signaled to Batista that the US would recognize a new civilian junta regime, but only if Grau and the so-called radicals around him were ejected from it. It was the first foreign policy challenge for the new FDR administration in Washington, and it was the first test of his good neighbor policy. Beals was not impressed. Through the machinations of Sumner Wells, he wrote, the popular aspirations were choked off, and Cuba, after considerable violence and disorder, has been saddled with an equally brutal and more ignorant Machado in the person of the upstart Army Sergeant Batista, who now enjoys the full blessings of the State Department. I now jump ahead, staying in Cuba, but jumping ahead 30 years, and I'm skipping here a lot of Beals's life, obviously, his late 1930s and wartime journalism, as well as his career crisis in the 1940s and 50s. That slump ended as a new Cuban revolution arose in 1959. By then, Beals was 66 and recently remarried after a split with his Peruvian wife, Blanca, and finally emerging from lean years of few contracts. But now his career was revived, once again by the nation. Carrie McWilliams, the magazine's new editor, had sent him to Cuba in 1957 to do a series of stories on unrest against Batista's regime. Public interest in Cuba had spiked after New York Times reporter Herbert Matthews interviewed Fidel Castro in his Sierra Maestra camp, as Beals had done with Sandino some 30 years earlier. Beals did not meet Castro, but he was impressed by the popular support he had gained. He was, however, skeptical of what he called this daredevil in the hills. When Castro seized power in 1959, Beals hurried back to Havana and witnessed Castro's triumphant entry with his 26th of July movement troops. He remained for several weeks, documenting the euphoria of the takeover, including an article that defended the integrity of the Cuban government's trials and executions of Batista officials, which were being criticized by US congressmen and mainstream media. At about the same time, Beals agreed to be co-chair with Waldo Frank of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, organized by liberal intellectuals, appalled by the growing attacks on Cuba's revolution by the US media and governing elite. He traveled to Cuba again in May 1960, where he was received once again as a gran amigo de Cuba, interviewed by media, and welcomed as a guest speaker at the Casa de las Americas. He was also invited by Jorge Ricardo Massetti, whom we see in the picture below, to be a roving correspondent for Prensa Latina, the new Cuban news agency, which aimed to counter narratives in US-owned wire services that were deeply suspicious, not only of the Cuban Revolution, but of liberation movements then emerging in many countries of what was now called the Third World. In this last role with Prensa Latina, contradictions arose for Beals once again. Was he a journalist or an advocate? He saw himself as an independent writer. Certainly, he had a point of view, an opinion, but he would argue that this was his own, drawn from his own experience, not dictated by the owner of whatever news medium in which his work appeared. I should mention, Beals is probably the only reporter who simultaneously reported for both the New York Times and TASS. So he was quite a polyglot in his choices of publications. The Bay of Pigs, though, changed the revolution, and Prensa Latina along with it. The hardliners took over, and Prensa Latina's earlier freewheeling approach under Massetti was shelved in favor of direct Communist Party control. I should mention in this picture where you see Massetti, that's Carlton Beals on the right signing the contract. He was to get $50 an article for his pieces as a roving correspondent. So Massetti was out and he was replaced by Fernando Revueltas, a Spaniard who imposed party discipline on its correspondence. Beals was told to clear all his speeches with Prensa Latina's head office. He refused and his contract was canceled. And with the US and Cuba now openly enemies, the very narrow space for fair play had closed altogether, and the Fair Play for Cuba Committee folded. In the last 2 decades of his life, Beals kept writing. As a lifelong freelancer, he had no pension, so he kept producing books to survive, most of them histories and biographies for young readers that his enterprising agent found for him. Working from an old schoolhouse in rural Connecticut, he also wrote analytical pieces for the National Guardian, a leftist weekly out of New York. He was happy, though, enjoying the company of his last wife, Carolyn, who doted on him. He died in 1979, just a few weeks before the Sandinistas seized power in Nicaragua. I've read pretty much all of Beals's work. And as I read, the word prescient kept coming to mind. And that is what prompted the claims I make on his behalf. One finds, sprinkled through his work, observations that point to or serve as germinating seeds for, or examples of theories that would emerge later. He developed an analytical framework, much akin to the widespread critical theory we see in academia and left progressive journalism today. He saw through the cant and hypocrisy used to justify US military intervention in Latin American and other developing countries. He recognized that these countries' peoples had their own agendas, often neither communist nor capitalist, that for them, neo-imperialism was real and every bit as anti-democratic as the regimes imposed on colonies by the European powers. This led him to outline in his 1937 book, America South, a rough approximation of what would later be called dependency theory, which in turn was at the root of Raoul Prebisch's 1950s CEPAL thesis of import substituting industrialization, or ISI. It became the policy of choice for many countries in Latin America and elsewhere, at least until national economies dissolved into an increasingly borderless global one. In 1938, Time magazine called Beals the best informed and most awkward living writer on Latin America. The awkwardness said more about the critic than about the subject. Those who come under the scrutiny of investigative journalists do not generally welcome the attention, so they accuse the journalists of having an agenda. Sometimes they do have an agenda, or at least a bias, but that doesn't necessarily invalidate their investigation, their questions, or their findings. Time magazine had an agenda, that of Henry Luce, who championed the idea of the American century. So yes, Beals was awkward, like a Shakespearean fool is awkward, pointing out the lies often hidden behind mainstream narratives. I was struck by the fact that many Latin American intellectuals, contemporaries of Beals, writers, journalists, even politicians, did not share the view that his work was awkward or radical. Many agreed with his distinctly third worldist perspective as being more akin to conventional wisdom. As I considered his legacy or long-term relevance, I came up against a paradox. Can one claim, as I do, that Beals's influence as a precursor of investigative journalists of the so-called radical school when he is pretty much forgotten now? I think so, partly because it is in the nature of journalism to be a first draft of history, to use the cliche. Journalism is ephemeral, and so most journalists, however well-known and widely read in their time, are often quickly forgotten. And Beals was quite famous in his time, even as he was, for some, an awkward outlier. I argue that his fearless critique of American foreign policy in its awkwardness was a precursor of reporters such as David Halberstam and his critique of the US war in Vietnam in the 1960s, or Seymour Hersh, who broke the My Lai massacre story, among others, or Raymond Bonner, who revealed the El Mozote massacre in El Salvador and wrote trenchantly of what he called US weakness and deceit in that country in the 1980s. In Beals's time, however, this kind of journalism was new, inasmuch as the imperial or neo-imperial character of US foreign policy was still in its salad days. I found that reading through Beals's work illuminates the evolution of that kind of US foreign policy and the critique that arose to challenge it. That's why I call Beals a rebel scribe whose journalism constituted a progressive challenge to US foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Chris, for that fascinating talk and presentation that summarizes your book on the fascinating life and work of Beals. We'll have plenty of time to discuss later on, but for the moment we have now two comments.